Welcome to the deep dive, listeners. You guys have sent us just a really, really interesting collection of stuff about how people behave in disasters, specifically around survival psychology. So, I'm pretty excited to jump into this one.
Yeah, it is fascinating stuff.
It is. And I know you're like the perfect person to help break this down for us.
Well, I'll certainly try my best.
Okay.
We're going to be exploring some really surprising reasons, I think, why people just, hesitate to get out of harm's way.
Right.
The science behind like how we actually react when we're scared, and some unexpected things that can turn everyday folks into heroes.
I'm so curious about this whole denial phase thing that the material keeps mentioning.
Right.
Like it seems, I don't know, it seems counterintuitive that people would delay reacting, when something bad is happening, when it's so obvious.
Well, it might seem that way, but the thing is, it's actually pretty common. The human brain is just wired to look for order, look for predictability, you know? So when we're confronted with something sudden, some catastrophe, our initial response a lot of times is to try to
Make it fit.
make it fit into what we already know, into our
Mhm.
existing models, even when those models just don't apply anymore.
Wow.
Yeah.
That example of the passengers on 9/11, like calmly gathering their belongings before getting out of the World Trade Center, like that just gives me chills.
Yeah, no, it's such a powerful illustration of that.
Yeah.
Clinging to routine, even when we're facing extreme danger,
Yeah.
the brain is really trying to, desperately trying to buy time to make sense of it all.
Yeah.
Sadly, that delay, that can be really deadly.
But at least there's some examples of people who kind of anticipated that delay and took steps to overcome it, right?
Yeah.
The story of Rick Rescorla, who was head of security at Morgan Stanley in the World Trade Center, he just really stood out to me. He seemed to have like this almost uncanny ability to predict how people would react under extreme pressure.
Well, he was very ahead of his time in understanding, I think, human behavior in disasters.
Right.
And he knew people would hesitate, so he just drilled his employees relentlessly.
Wow.
Yeah, on evacuation procedures.
Oh my gosh.
Even anticipated the possibility of an attack on the World Trade Center, which, at the time seemed
Unimaginable.
unimaginable. Yeah.
Just incredible to think that his foresight and preparedness saved thousands of lives.
Truly remarkable.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if there are things from his training program that, that we could all apply to our own lives.
Absolutely. I think one key takeaway is just, the importance of repetition, and realistic simulations.
Right.
He didn't just lecture his employees about fire safety. He actually had them practice evacuations
Oh, wow.
under all sorts of different scenarios, including, a simulated attack from the lower floors. Yeah, and, this constant drilling helped just embed those correct responses in their minds, so that when the unthinkable happened, they were able to act almost
Instinctively.
like instinctively.
It's like practicing for a play, but with much higher stakes.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
I've always been fascinated by just the physical sensations of fear, like the racing heart, the tunnel vision.
Sure.
What is actually happening in our brains and bodies when we experience fear?
Well, it's really a cascade of biological responses
Yeah.
that evolved to help us survive threats.
Right.
So when we perceive danger, our senses send signals to the amygdala, which is this part of the brain that acts as like an alarm system.
Okay.
And that triggers the release of hormones like adrenaline and cortisol, which then prepare us for that fight or flight response.
So it's like our body's going into battle mode.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, but some of the sources mention something called perceptual distortions.
Yeah.
I'm not really familiar with that.
Well, these are essentially errors in how our brains process sensory information during, periods of high stress.
Oh, okay.
So they can manifest in all kinds of ways. Some people experience tunnel vision,
Oh, right.
where their peripheral vision narrows.
I've heard of that.
Others might perceive time as slowing down or speeding up, and some even report auditory exclusion.
Auditory exclusion?
Yeah, where they can't hear sounds that are clearly present.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
So fear can actually mess with our senses.
It can really distort our perceptions of reality.
Is that common?
More than you might think, actually.
Really?
Studies have shown that these types of perceptual distortions are incredibly prevalent in high-stress situations.
Wow.
For example, a significant percentage of police officers who've been involved in shootings,
Right.
they report experiencing some form of perceptual distortion during the incident.
Wow, so it's not just a Hollywood thing, it's a real phenomenon.
No, it's very real.
Yeah.
And it can impact anyone.
Right, in a crisis.
Yeah, in a crisis situation.
I find that both fascinating and a little unsettling.
Yeah, I know, right?
Yeah, it makes you realize how important it is to kind of train for those moments when our brains might not be working at their best.
You got it.
Yeah.
And on that note, the sources actually highlight how repeated exposure to stressful situations
Oh.
can actually change the brain's wiring,
Mm.
making individuals more resilient to fear.
Right. So like think about firefighters, soldiers,
Exactly.
athletes, like people who train under pressure.
Yeah.
When they face real danger,
They're better equipped to handle it. Absolutely.
That's good news.
Yeah.
If they can train their brains, maybe we can too.
Well, the human brain is incredibly adaptable, and that's the good news.
Right.
We can learn to regulate our fear response and make better decisions under pressure,
Okay.
but it does take conscious effort and practice.
That makes sense, but I was surprised to learn that fear doesn't always lead to fight or flight. Yeah.
Some of the research suggests there's a third survival response, and that's freezing.
Right.
That's wild. It seems counterintuitive to just freeze up when something dangerous is happening.
It does, but it's a primal response known as tonic immobility, and it's hardwired into our brains. Think of a deer in headlights, you know?
Right.
It's not a conscious choice, but rather an involuntary reaction to a perceived threat.
That example of the Estonia ferry disaster is really haunting.
Yes.
Passengers froze on deck as the ship was sinking, seemingly unable to do anything.
Yeah.
It's just hard to comprehend that kind of paralysis in such a dire situation.
It's a tragic illustration, I think, of how this ancient survival mechanism, which might have helped our ancestors avoid predators,
Right.
can be, well, tragically maladaptive
Yeah.
in modern disasters where quick action is often essential for survival.
So what triggers that freeze response? Is it just like being totally overwhelmed by fear?
Well, fear is definitely a factor.
But researchers believe that tonic immobility is most likely triggered by a feeling of being trapped,
Okay.
of having no escape route. Yeah, it's as if the brain decides that staying perfectly still offers the best chance of survival,
Wow.
even when, that's clearly not the case.
That's fascinating and incredibly sad.
It is, yeah.
But knowing about this, I guess, could be the first step in overcoming it, right?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
By understanding, the science behind these primal reactions, we can start to develop strategies
Right.
for, mitigating those negative effects.
Right.
And making, more rational decisions in a crisis.
So there's hope for us yet.
There is.
Okay, good. Now, on to a more inspiring topic.
Yeah.
The psychology of heroism.
Sure.
The research you've compiled suggests that the motivation behind heroic acts might not be what we expect.
Yeah, that's right.
Not always about pure selflessness.
No, not necessarily.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
So the research actually suggests that heroism might actually be driven, at least in part, by a profound fear of something else entirely. Let's take the example of Roger Olien, who jumped into the icy Potomac River
Right.
to save survivors of a crowd crash.
Yeah, he wasn't a trained rescuer or anything.
No, just an ordinary guy who happened to be in the right place at the right time.
Right, and he wasn't some kind of adrenaline junkie looking for a thrill.
Oh,
he was just a regular guy who made a split-second decision to act.
Yeah, and his story, along with many others like it, really highlights this research, suggesting that heroism might actually stem from a deep-seated fear of living with the guilt of inaction. It's not so much about overcoming the fear of death,
Wow.
but rather the fear of living with the knowledge that you could have done something to help and didn't.
Wow, that's a powerful concept.
It is, yeah.
It completely reframes our understanding of courage.
Yeah, it suggests that heroes aren't necessarily fearless.
Right.
But rather individuals who are willing to act despite their fear.
Right.
Driven by a, deep sense of moral obligation.
Olien's words after the rescue are they're so poignant. He said, "I was pretty sure I was going to die. I was not going to turn my back on those folks."
Powerful words.
It gives me chills just thinking about it, but this idea that, heroism is a choice, not a personality trait, that's actually pretty empowering.
It is.
Yeah, it means that we all have that potential
Right.
within us.
We all have the capacity for courage, but it often takes, a very specific set of circumstances to bring it to the surface.
So if heroes are made, not born, does that mean we can actually train ourselves to be more heroic? Like, can we rewire our brains to be more likely to act in a crisis?
That's a fantastic question, and one that researchers are really actively exploring.
Okay.
And there is evidence to suggest that we can, to a certain extent, prepare ourselves to respond,
Yeah.
more effectively in a crisis.
I'm all ear.
Okay, well, the sources you provided highlight the work of Ron Langford,
Okay.
who's a race car driver who, after a personal tragedy, dedicated his life to teaching advanced driving skills,
Okay.
focused on rewiring subconscious reactions.
Wow.
Yeah, pretty interesting stuff.
I'm curious to learn more about his methods. What does his training actually involve?
Well, he really focuses on using, realistic simulations and drills to reprogram how drivers react to danger.
Hmm.
He teaches them how to handle skids, how to control their vehicles under pressure,
Right.
and essentially program their brains for better performance in emergencies.
Mm.
He really believes that by, repeatedly practicing the correct responses in a safe environment, we can overwrite those ingrained instincts that often lead to accidents.
So it's almost like we're overriding our instincts with training.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay.
It's like building muscle memory, but for our brains.
That's a great way to put it. Okay, so his approach seems to be based on the idea that we can essentially train our brains to respond differently to fear.
Exactly.
Okay.
He believes that by exposing ourselves to, controlled doses of fear and stress, we can build up a tolerance and learn to make better decisions
Okay.
when faced with, real danger.
Yeah, like exposure therapy almost.
It is. Yeah, it's a lot like that.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like giving their brains a dress rehearsal for a crisis.
I love that.
Yeah,
This is also fascinating.
it is. Yeah.
It's like we're just beginning to scratch the surface of what's possible when it comes to understanding and training our survival instincts.
I think you're right.
Yeah, I'm eager to learn more.
Wait.
What other insights do these sources offer? Where do we go from here?
Well, from here, let's delve into the concept of risk perception.
All right.
You might be surprised at how often our gut reactions about what's dangerous are actually quite inaccurate.
Okay, I'm ready. Okay, risk perception. It's something I've definitely thought about, especially after, reading about those reactions to 9/11. There was a huge increase in traffic fatalities right after because people were so afraid of flying, they decided to drive instead,
Right.
which statistically was a much riskier choice.
It is a classic example of how, our instinctive perceptions of risk don't always align with reality.
Right.
Our brains evolved to be, hyper aware of threats that were really common in our ancestral environment.
Right, like saber-toothed tigers.
Yeah, like predators and venomous creatures and things like that.
Yeah, yeah.
But when it comes to assessing more modern risks,
Right.
like those posed by technology or complex systems, our instincts,
They're not as reliable.
they're not as reliable now.
Yeah, it's like our brains are still playing catch up with the modern world.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. And this mismatch between our ancient wiring and our modern environment can lead to some really fascinating inconsistencies in how we perceive danger.
Okay.
For instance, people tend to overestimate the likelihood of, really dramatic but rare events,
Okay.
like plane crashes or terrorist attacks, while underestimating more common but, less sensational risks, like heart disease or car accidents.
Right. It seems like the things that make headlines and capture our imaginations, those tend to have just an outsized influence on our perceptions of risk.
Oh, absolutely. The media plays a really significant role
Yeah.
in shaping how we perceive danger. Sensational stories, they grab our attention,
Right.
they trigger our emotional responses,
Yeah.
which can really distort our assessment of, what's truly risky.
So how do we combat this? Like how do we combat this tendency to overestimate certain risks and underestimate others?
Well, I think, it seems like we need to be more critical consumers of information, right? Especially when it comes to news and media.
Yeah, yeah.
You're right. It's crucial to be aware of how those media narratives
Right.
can influence our perceptions of risk.
Okay.
We need to look beyond the headlines, seek out those reliable sources of data and analysis.
Okay.
And in the show notes for this deep dive, we'll be sure to include some links to some excellent resources that provide evidence-based information about various risks that we face in the modern world.
Okay, that's super helpful.
Yeah.
So we've talked about, how our perceptions of risk can be skewed.
Right.
But what about those moments when danger is immediate and real.
Sure.
What are some strategies for staying calm and making rational decisions when we're, under pressure?
That's a great question. One key factor, I think, in managing that fear and panic
Okay.
is just having a sense of control.
Okay.
Even if it's just, an illusion of control.
Mm.
Studies have shown that when people feel like they have some agency in a dangerous situation,
they're less likely to just give in to that panic.
So it's not just about knowing what to do,
Yeah.
but also like believing that you can actually do something to influence the outcome.
Exactly. And this is where, training and preparation really, really play a crucial role.
Right. If you've mentally rehearsed how to react.
Yeah, if you've already thought about it in a fire or an earthquake, you're much more likely to stay calm and execute those actions when the real event occurs.
Right.
You've essentially pre-programmed your brain to respond effectively.
It's like building confidence through practice.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that.
The more we practice those right responses, the less likely we are to just freeze up when it really matters.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And another powerful tool for, staying cool under pressure is self-talk.
Self-talk.
Yeah, this involves just consciously using words to guide your thoughts and actions. So, for example, if you find yourself starting to panic,
you might say to yourself, okay, take a deep breath. What's the next step?
Right, right.
This kind of internal dialogue can really help break that cycle of negative thoughts that can spiral into full-blown panic.
It's like giving ourselves a pep talk.
Yeah, exactly.
In the midst of chaos.
Exactly. And it can be surprisingly effective.
Okay. Yeah.
It helps us, shift our focus from those overwhelming emotions to the practical steps we need to take to survive.
Okay. Shifting gears a bit, I'd like to talk about crowd behavior in disasters.
Yeah.
It seems like crowds have the potential to become, chaotic and dangerous.
Right.
Especially when people are panicking. Is that a valid concern?
It's a common perception.
Yeah.
Fueled by those dramatic scenes in movies and TV shows.
Yeah.
But the reality is that panic in crowds is actually, it's relatively rare.
Really?
Yeah, people are far more likely to help each other.
Oh, wow.
Than to, trample each other in a crisis.
That's surprising. Why is there such a disconnect between, like, the perception and the reality?
Well, I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier.
Okay.
About how our brains are wired
right.
to focus on those potential threats.
Right.
When we see a large crowd,
right.
especially in a stressful situation, our ancient alarm system kicks in.
Right.
And we instinctively assume the worst.
So our evolutionary baggage is kind of leading us to misjudge the situation?
In a sense, yes. The research actually shows that people in crowds, they tend to form like these spontaneous groups.
Okay.
And work together to, figure out what to do.
Oh, wow.
They look to each other for cues on how to behave and often exhibit remarkable altruism and cooperation.
So group dynamics can actually be a positive force.
They can, yeah.
Okay, that's good to know.
Absolutely.
But surely there are times when crowds can be dangerous, right?
Yeah.
Like I'm thinking about situations like the Hajj pilgrimage in Mecca, where crowd surges have tragically resulted in fatalities.
You're right. There are certainly circumstances where crowds can become hazardous.
Okay.
Especially when there's, poor crowd management, inadequate infrastructure, or, a sudden trigger event that sparks a kind of chain reaction of pushing and shoving.
Right.
The Hajj pilgrimage is a tragic example of how a confluence of factors can lead to a catastrophic crowd surge.
So it's not just about the crowd itself, but also the context and the conditions.
Exactly.
It seems like being aware of those, crowd dynamics and taking steps to avoid potentially dangerous situations, that's essential.
It is, yeah.
What are some things that people can do to, stay safe in a crowd?
Well, if you find yourself in a large gathering, especially one that feels, crowded or chaotic,
right.
Try to stay near the edges of the crowd.
Okay.
Have an escape route in mind. Be aware of your surroundings. And just pay attention to any changes in the mood or movement of the crowd.
Right.
If you sense a surge or a panic starting, try to move laterally to the edge of the crowd, or find a sturdy object to hold on to.
Okay, those are great tips.
Yeah.
I'm also curious about the role of leadership in disasters.
Sure.
Does having a strong leader make a difference in how people behave and how well they cope?
Leadership can make all the difference.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Effective leaders can provide, direction,
Uh-huh.
reassurance,
Right.
and a sense of hope in the midst of chaos. They can
Mhm.
calm people down.
Mhm.
They can help them get
Yep.
organized
Right.
and focus their efforts on taking effective action.
So it's not just about being in charge, it's about knowing how to inspire and motivate people
Exactly.
to work together towards a common goal.
You got leaders to project confidence and confidence. They're
Yeah.
they're more likely to be followed. They also need to be, good communicators,
Of course.
able to clearly explain what's happening and what needs to be done.
Hmm.
Rick Rescorla, the security chief at Morgan Stanley, who we discussed earlier,
Right, right.
he's a perfect example of effective leadership in a disaster.
Yeah.
His decisive actions and clear communication saved countless lives on 9/11.
He's definitely a role model for leadership in a crisis.
Yeah, absolutely.
And as we discussed, his success wasn't just about giving orders.
Right.
It was about preparation,
Right.
training, and building a culture of preparedness within his organization.
Absolutely. The best leaders, they anticipate those potential problems.
Right.
And they have plans in place to address them.
Okay.
They also empower their followers
Right.
to take initiative
Mm.
and make decisions on their own,
Right.
which can be really crucial in fast-moving situations.
So if you suddenly find yourself in a leadership role during a crisis, what's the most important thing to remember?
The key is to stay calm.
Yeah.
Assess the situation.
Right.
Focus on the immediate needs of the group.
Right.
Don't try to be a hero.
Okay.
Just be, clear,
Right. Yeah.
decisive,
Okay.
and supportive.
Okay.
And remember, even small acts of leadership
Right.
can make a big difference in helping people, cope and work together towards safety.
That's really helpful advice. Now I'd like to shift our focus to individual resilience.
Okay.
What makes some people bounce back from trauma
Sure.
while others struggle? Is resilience something we're born with, or is it something we can develop?
That's a question that researchers have been exploring for decades.
Right.
And the good news is that resilience, while influenced by genetics,
Okay.
is not solely determined by our DNA.
Okay.
It's a complex trait
Okay.
that can be cultivated and strengthened through, conscious effort and practice.
Okay, that's encouraging. So we're not just stuck with our initial disaster personality, so to speak.
No, not at all.
We can actually train ourselves to be more resilient.
You can, absolutely.
Okay, and the research points to several factors that contribute to resilience.
Yes.
One is a physical fitness.
Yeah.
People who are in good physical shape tend to have, more stamina,
More energy.
Oh. Which can be really crucial for coping with the demands of a disaster.
Right.
They're also less likely to suffer injuries or succumb to exhaustion.
Absolutely.
That makes sense. If your body is strong and healthy,
Right.
you're just better equipped to handle those physical and mental challenges.
Yeah, precisely.
Another key factor is mental toughness.
Yes, mental toughness.
People who have a strong sense of self-efficacy, that is, the belief in their own ability to handle challenges,
Right.
they tend to be more resilient.
They do.
Yeah.
They're less likely to give up in the face of adversity and more likely to find ways to cope and adapt.
So it's not just about physical strength, it's about, mental fortitude as well.
Absolutely. And this is where things like mindfulness and stress management techniques and cognitive behavioral therapy can be incredibly valuable.
Right.
They help us build those mental muscles
Right.
that we need to, stay calm,
Right.
focused,
Right.
and problem solve under pressure.
Okay, but what about those people who seem to have an almost supernatural ability
Right.
to stay calm in the face of danger?
Yeah, they're out there.
Are they just wired differently, or is
Yeah.
there something else going on?
Well, while some individuals may have, a genetic predisposition
Yeah.
to be more resilient,
Right.
research actually suggests that much of what we call natural resilience is actually a combination of learned behaviors,
Mm-hmm.
coping mechanisms, and experiences that have shaped their responses
Okay.
to stress and adversity.
So it's nature and nurture working together.
It is, yeah.
What are some specific strategies that people can use to cultivate resilience? Are there things that we can do in our daily lives
Oh, yeah.
to build up those mental and emotional reserves?
There are many, many practical things you can do to build resilience.
Okay.
Exercise is a great place to start.
Okay.
It not only strengthens your body,
Right.
but also releases endorphins that have, mood boosting and stress reducing effects.
Okay.
Meditation and mindfulness practices are also proven to reduce stress,
Right.
improve emotional regulation.
So it's about taking care of our mental and emotional well-being,
Yeah,
just as we would, our physical health.
exactly. And don't underestimate the power of, social connections,
Oh, yeah.
spending time with loved ones,
Yeah.
nurturing your relationships,
Yeah.
building a strong support network can make a huge difference in your ability to cope with stress and adversity.
I love that. So building resilience isn't just about like gritting our teeth and powering through.
No, not at all.
It's about taking care of ourselves holistically.
You got it. And don't be afraid to seek, professional help if you're struggling.
Right.
Therapists and counselors can provide, really valuable tools and support
Right.
for building resilience and managing stress.
All of this is starting to make a lot of sense, but I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier.
Sure.
This clash between our modern environment and our ancient instincts.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on that a bit more? It seems like a crucial piece of understanding why we sometimes struggle to cope with, the challenges of the modern world.
It's a fascinating paradox. Our brains evolved in a world of immediate physical threats.
Right.
Predators, natural disasters, tribal warfare.
Right.
We developed this set of instinctive responses
Right.
to help us survive in that environment.
Right.
But today, many of the dangers we face are more abstract,
Right.
and complex.
You mean things like climate change, pandemics,
Yeah.
cyber attacks, the constant barrage of information overload?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
These threats require different skills and strategies than those our ancestors used.
Okay.
We need to be able to think critically. We need to be able to plan for the long term.
Right.
We need to be able to cooperate on a global scale
Right.
and filter through vast amounts of information.
So our old instincts aren't always helpful in today's world.
Right.
They can sometimes lead us astray.
No, they can, for example, our tendency to focus on the immediate threat
Right.
can make it really difficult to address, long-term challenges that require, sustained effort and collaboration.
It's like we're constantly fighting the last war instead of preparing for the next one.
That's a brilliant analogy.
Yeah.
So the challenge is to, become aware of those ingrained biases.
Okay.
And develop, new ways of thinking and responding that are better suited to the complexities of the modern world. It's about bridging the gap between our ancient brains and our modern realities.
So how do we do that? How do we reconcile our evolutionary heritage with, the demands of 21st century life?
One key is education.
Okay.
We need to understand how our minds work,
Right.
including, the limitations of our instinctive responses. The more we know about ourselves, the better equipped we are to make those conscious, informed decisions.
It seems like what we're doing right now on this deep dive
Yeah.
is a good example of that.
Yeah, exactly.
By exploring these concepts and sharing this knowledge, we're helping people to understand their own minds better.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
Knowledge is power. And understanding is the first step towards change.
Okay.
Another key is to, actively practice new ways of thinking and behaving.
Okay.
If we want to be more adaptable and resilient in the face of modern challenges, we need to step outside of our comfort zones, challenge those ingrained patterns.
So it's about rewiring our brains, just like those race car drivers we talked about.
Precisely, we can train ourselves to be, more mindful, more strategic, and more cooperative.
Okay.
We can learn to think, long term, and to focus on solutions instead of just reacting to problems.
This is all pretty mind-blowing stuff. It's almost like we're at a turning point in human evolution.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah.
We have to adapt to survive, and maybe even thrive.
Yeah.
In this rapidly changing world.
I couldn't agree more. It's an exciting and challenging time to be alive.
It is.
Yeah.
We have the potential to, shape our own destiny,
Right.
but it requires, a conscious effort to evolve.
Right.
We need to become more than just, survivors.
Right.
We need to become thrivers.
That's a fantastic way to put it. So in a way, preparing for disasters and building resilience,
Right.
it isn't just about stockpiling supplies and knowing how to evacuate.
No.
It's about evolving as a species.
I think so.
It's about developing those mental and emotional skills
Right.
we need to navigate the complexities of the modern world.
Beautifully said. It's about recognizing that the greatest threats we face may not be the ones that trigger our, ancient fight or flight response,
Right.
but rather the ones that require us to think differently, to adapt,
Right.
to collaborate, and to embrace the unknown.
Okay, I'm ready for more. What other insights do these sources offer? Where do we go from here?
Let's explore some specific examples of disasters and how people responded.
Okay.
You might be surprised at the ingenuity, the courage, and the resilience
Okay.
that emerge in even the most challenging circumstances.
Okay.
I think these real-life stories will bring all of these concepts to life and provide some valuable lessons for all of us.
I'm ready to hear those stories. The sources mention this fascinating hostage crisis that took place at the Dominican Embassy in Bogota, Colombia, back in 1980.
Oh yeah, that's a great example.
Yeah.
It's a situation where, quick thinking and a deep understanding of human behavior really made a difference in the outcome.
Hmm.
A group of guerrillas took over the embassy, holding dozens of diplomats and guests hostage for months.
Oh my gosh, that must have been just terrifying for those hostages.
It was a horrific ordeal.
Yeah.
But amidst all that chaos and terror, one hostage, a diplomat named Diego Asensio, he demonstrated remarkable resilience and leadership.
Hmm.
He recognized early on that panic and despair would be their worst enemies.
So instead of, giving in to the fear, he sought to take control of the situation however he could.
Exactly. Asensio, he understood that they needed to stay calm,
Right.
organized and unified if they were going to survive, both physically and mentally.
Right.
He encouraged the hostages to, establish routines, to support each other,
Yeah.
and to focus on, maintaining a sense of normalcy amidst these extraordinary circumstances.
Oh.
They even started a newspaper called the Embassy Times
Really?
as a way to, stay connected and maintain a sense of purpose.
That's incredible. It speaks volumes about just, the power of the human spirit to find ways to cope and even thrive in the most challenging environments.
Yeah, I think it's a reminder that even in captivity, maintaining a sense of agency, however small, can make a huge difference.
Absolutely. And Asensio didn't stop there. He also recognized the importance of understanding the psychology of their captors.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, he made a conscious effort to learn their names,
Okay.
to engage them in conversations,
Right.
and to really humanize the situation.
So instead of viewing them as simply the enemy, he sought to understand their motivations.
Yes.
And connect with them on a human level.
Precisely. And that shift in perspective proved to be really crucial. It allowed him to build a rapport with the captors,
Okay.
negotiate more effectively, and ultimately gain a measure of control over the situation.
Asensio's story is it's a testament to the power of staying calm under pressure,
Yes.
understanding human behavior, and finding ways to maintain hope, even in the darkest of circumstances.
I agree.
Yeah, his experience provides some truly valuable lessons, I think, in resilience and leadership.
Yeah.
Okay, shifting gears a bit, I want to talk about those moments when we have to make, split-second decisions in a crisis.
Okay.
Like when we're driving and suddenly someone cuts us off, or we encounter an unexpected hazard.
Right.
What's going on in our brains during those moments?
Well, those are the moments when our subconscious programming really takes over.
Okay.
There's simply not enough time for conscious thought.
Right.
We react based on, our deeply ingrained habits and instincts.
So it's like our training, or lack thereof, kicks in automatically.
Precisely. Ron Langford, the race car driver we discussed earlier,
Right.
he talks about this extensively.
Yeah.
He emphasizes that, in those high-pressure moments,
Right.
we don't have time to think.
Right.
Our reactions are driven by those subconscious reflexes.
Right.
That's why he's so passionate about teaching people the the right reactions,
Okay.
the ones that are most likely to keep them safe.
Because if we practice the right skills, the right moves over and over again.
They become second nature.
Yeah, like muscle memory.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when we encounter a sudden threat, those well-trained responses they'll take over.
Right.
Even before our conscious mind has time to process what's happening.
Exactly. It's about creating a new set of default reactions that are aligned with,
Right.
safety and survival.
Right.
Langford, he compares it to athletes, training for competition.
Right.
They practice their moves so diligently
Right.
that when they're in the game,
Yeah.
their bodies they just know what to do.
Right.
Without conscious thought.
It's fascinating to think that we can apply those same principles of muscle memory to our brains.
Yeah, I think so too.
It's like we're building a mental library of emergency responses that we can just access instinctively.
Exactly.
When the need arises.
Yeah.
The sources mention that Langford uses some pretty intense simulations in his training.
Oh yeah, he does.
Can you tell me more about those? Well, he's a firm believer in the power of realistic simulations to prepare drivers for the unexpected.
Okay.
He puts his students through, incredibly realistic scenarios,
Wow.
including, skids, sudden hazards, even simulated car accidents.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, it's pretty intense stuff.
That sounds intense, but also incredibly valuable.
It is.
By experiencing those high stress situations in a safe environment,
Right.
they can kind of build up their tolerance for fear.
Right, and learn how to react effectively without panicking.
Exactly. The goal is to expose them to the feeling of fear and adrenaline in a controlled setting.
Right.
So that when they encounter similar situations in real life, their brains are they're better prepared to handle the stress and make those rational decisions.
They've been there before.
Right. It's like giving their brains a dress rehearsal for a crisis.
Exactly.
I like that.
Yeah.
So it seems like, realistic simulations are a key tool for rewiring those subconscious reflexes and preparing for those split-second decisions.
I think so. Yeah.
Is there anything else we can do to enhance our ability to make good decisions under pressure?
Well, one thing that's often overlooked
Okay.
is the importance of managing stress in our daily lives.
Mhm.
Chronic stress can actually impair our cognitive abilities.
Really?
Including our decision-making skills.
Wow.
It's like having this constant background hum of anxiety that interferes with our ability to think clearly and process information effectively.
So even if we're not, facing an immediate threat,
Right.
that chronic stress can still be a liability when it comes to making good decisions in a crisis.
Absolutely. When our stress levels are chronically elevated, our brains are essentially stuck in this heightened state of alert.
Mm.
And this can lead to, impulsive decisions, poor judgment, and an increased likelihood of panicking when faced with a sudden threat.
Right.
That's why it's so important to develop, healthy coping mechanisms for managing stress in our daily lives.
It seems like taking care of our mental and emotional well-being is just as important as physical fitness when it comes to preparing for a crisis.
I agree.
We need to make sure that our brains are functioning optimally so we can make those clear-headed decisions when it matters most.
Couldn't agree more. Things like, exercise, meditation, spending time in nature, pursuing hobbies you enjoy.
Right.
These are all great ways to reduce stress and improve cognitive function.
So, in a way, disaster preparedness is about so much more than just, stockpiling supplies and having an evacuation plan.
It is.
It's about cultivating a mindset of resilience, both physically and mentally.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's about understanding our innate responses to danger, managing stress, building mental toughness, and practicing the skills we need to navigate the unexpected.
This deep dive has been an incredible journey of discovery. I mean,
it has.
We've explored so many fascinating insights into human behavior, the science of fear, the power of resilience.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
We started by talking about that almost universal human tendency to, freeze or delay.
Right.
When confronted with danger, and how that can be explained by the brain's, attempt to make sense of a chaotic situation. Then We explored the science of fear itself, how it affects our brains and bodies,
Oh,
and
yeah.
how we can, train ourselves to manage those instinctive reactions more effectively.
We also delved into those surprising motivations behind heroism.
Yeah, yeah.
Debunking that myth that heroes are fearless and highlighting the powerful role that moral obligation and a deep aversion to guilt can play in driving heroic actions.
Yeah, it's really fascinating stuff.
It is, and we learned that crowds, often portrayed as breeding grounds for panic, are actually more likely to exhibit cooperation and altruism in a crisis.
Right, that's fair.
We discussed the importance of effective leadership in guiding groups towards safety
Yeah.
and explored the factors that contribute to individual resilience,
Right.
emphasizing that it's a trait that can be cultivated and strengthened through conscious effort.
Absolutely.
It's been a truly eye-opening exploration of human nature at its best and worst.
I think so.
And it's left me feeling both more aware of the challenges we face and more optimistic about our ability to overcome them.
That's great to hear.
Yeah, if there's one key message I hope you take away from this deep dive,
Okay.
it's this.
I'm listening.
Don't wait for a disaster to happen and
Okay.
start thinking about preparedness.
Yeah, yeah.
Take initiative.
Take action.
Educate yourself.
Yes.
Practice the skills you need.
Absolutely.
Build your resilience.
You got it.
You are capable of far more than you realize.
I believe that too.
That's a powerful message and one that I hope our listeners will take to heart.
Me too.
Thank you so much for guiding us through this incredible deep dive.
The pleasure was all mine.
It's been a true privilege to learn from you.
Likewise.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this exploration of survival psychology. We hope you found it insightful and empowering.
I hope so.
Remember, knowledge is power. Now it's time to take action. Explore the resources in our show notes.
Yes.
Start thinking about how you can prepare yourself and your loved ones for whatever life throws your way.
Be prepared.
And until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.